Hey there, welcome to Mr. Cozy True Crime Stories. Tonight, we're diving into 2 hours of gripping true crime cases. Real stories of mystery, betrayal, and cold-blooded crimes, all set against the soothing backdrop of rain. It's the perfect blend of calm and unsettling. If these cases draw you in, tap that like button, share with your fellow true crime lovers, and subscribe to join our curious community. I'm always wondering, where are you tuning in from? And what time is it for you right now? Drop it in the comments below. Now settle in, and let's dig into the darkness. Story 1. There is a grief that belongs exclusively to parents. The one that arrives when they understand, in a single, irreversible moment, that they will never see their child alive again. Phil Vetrano, a retired New York City firefighter who had spent his career running toward the worst moments in other people's lives, experienced that grief on the evening of August 2nd, 2016, in a stretch of tall marsh grass at the edge of Spring Creek Park in Howard Beach, Queens. He had gone looking for his daughter. He found her in the weeds, face down, 15 feet from the trail she had been running. The man who had carried her as a baby, who had jogged beside her through these same paths for years, knelt beside her in the fading summer light and understood that nothing in the rest of his life would ever be the same. Karina and Vetrano was 30 years old. She had been born on July 12, 1986, and had grown up in Howard Beach, a working-class neighborhood on the edge of Jamaica Bay, in the southern part of Queens, where the flat landscape opens toward the water and the air carries a faint mineral tang from the wetlands. She was a speech therapist, a profession built on the act of helping others find their voice, on the patient and technical work of restoring communication to those who had lost it. She was a graduate of St. John's University. She was funny, warm, and direct, the kind of person whose personality filled the room she was in and whose absence would be felt at every table she had ever sat at. She was close to her parents, Phil and Kathy, in the specific and irreplaceable way that adult children who have chosen to remain near their families are close, not out of obligation, but out of genuine love for the people who had raised her. Running was something she shared with her father. The two of them would jog together through Spring Creek Park, a stretch of protected wetlands that borders Howard Beach on its southern edge, a place of reeds and marsh grass, narrow asphalt paths cutting through the wild overgrowth, the distant sounds of the Belt Parkway and the bay. It was familiar terrain, as safe in their minds as any landscape that you have crossed hundreds of times can feel. They ran it together regularly. It was their routine, their shared language in the grammar of physical movement and open air. On August 2nd, 2016, Phil Vetrano's back was bothering him. He told Karina he would sit this one out. She decided to go anyway. It was a Tuesday evening in early August, warm, the sky lightening slowly toward dusk. She laced her shoes, took her phone, and headed out alone. It was the first time she had jogged in Spring Creek Park without her father beside her. She was 30 years old, an adult in every sense of the word, and the park was a place she knew intimately. There was no reason, in any ordinary understanding of the world, not to go. She did not come back at her usual time. When the evening stretched past the hour when Karina should have been home, Phil and Kathy Vetrano grew uneasy with the quiet certainty of people who know their child and know that something is wrong. They called a neighbor, a man who worked for the New York Police Department, and then they called the police themselves. And then Phil Vetrano, retired firefighter, 60-year-old man with a bad back, went into Spring Creek Park and searched for his daughter the only way a father knows how, by moving through the dark with her name in his throat, looking at every place she might be, not stopping until he found her. When he found her, the scene told its story immediately and terribly. Karina Vetrano had been physically assaulted. She had been beaten. She had been strangled. She was face down in the marsh grass, 15 feet from the jogging path, her sports bra and shorts pulled down, scrapes and bruises covering her body and legs. Her teeth were broken, cracked in the specific way that comes from biting hard during a struggle, from using every part of your body as a weapon against an attacker who has the advantage of size and surprise. The New York City Police Department, when they assessed the scene, used a phrase that was both clinically accurate and deeply human in its implications. Karina Vetrano had put up a ferocious fight. She had fought back with everything she had. She had not surrendered. The medical examiner confirmed strangulation as the cause of death. The manner was homicide. Chief of Detectives Robert Boyce stood before cameras and told the public that investigators believed the attack was random, that there was no evidence the killer had known Karina, that she had simply been in a place where a dangerous person also happened to be. He described it as a severe community threat. Women who jogged alone, who walked through parks, who moved through the familiar landscapes of their own neighborhoods, had reason to be afraid. A reward of $10,000 was offered for information. The forensic team processed the crime scene with the methodical thoroughness that NYPD major case investigations demand. What they recovered was significant. DNA belonging to someone other than Karina Vetrano was found in 3 separate locations. Beneath her fingernails, the direct result of her fighting back, of scratching her attacker, on her back, and on her cell phone, which was found approximately 200 yards from where her body lay, discarded. The DNA was entered into CODIS, the national DNA database maintained by the FBI, and cross-referenced against every profile in the system. It did not match anyone. The killer was not in the database. The investigation, despite the quality of the biological evidence, had no name to attach to it. 6 months passed. For the Vetrano family, those 6 months were an anguish that compounded daily. They had buried their daughter. They had sat through the particular indignity of public grief, the press conferences, the reporters outside the house, the sympathy that arrives in overwhelming waves, and then gradually recedes back into other people's ordinary lives, while the family's extraordinary grief remains, unchanged, permanent. Kathy Vetrano, who had given birth to Karina 30 years before, who had watched her daughter build a life and a career and a community of people who loved her, spoke publicly about the man who had taken her daughter and used the word demon. Not a legal term, not a clinical description, but the word of a mother who needed language large enough to contain the scale of what had been done. The break in the case arrived not through new technology or a fresh lead from the tip line, but through something far simpler and more human, the memory of a police officer. Lieutenant John Russo, one of the case detectives, remembered something. 3 months before Karina's murder, in May 2016, he had called the police on a young black man who had been walking through Howard Beach, behaving in a way that had seemed out of place to the detective. The man's presence in that neighborhood had been unusual enough to prompt a call. When Russo recalled that incident and connected it to the geography of the Vetrano investigation, the park, the path, the neighborhood, a name surfaced. Chanel Lewis. Chanel Lewis was 20 years old, a resident of East New York, Brooklyn, a neighborhood several miles from Howard Beach. Investigators went to his home. They explained what they were investigating. They asked if he would be willing to provide a DNA sample. Lewis agreed. His mother was present in the room. He allowed officers to swab the inside of his cheek, the simple, painless procedure that would either clear him or end his freedom. He had, apparently, no sense of what was about to happen. The DNA was analyzed. It was an exact match to every sample recovered from Karina Vetrano's body and her phone. The biological material beneath her fingernails, material she had fought to collect even as she died, belonged to Chanel Lewis. There was no ambiguity. There was no partial match, no probability range. The DNA profile recovered from 3 separate locations at the crime scene matched one person, and one person only. The young man from East New York who had agreed to a swab inside his own home while his mother stood nearby. On February 4th, 2017, 6 months and 2 days after Karina Vetrano died in Spring Creek Park, Chanel Lewis was arrested. He was taken into custody on charges of murder and abuse. During the police interview that followed his arrest, he gave what prosecutors would later describe as a detailed, incriminating account of what happened. He told investigators he had seen Karina on the jogging path and had just lost it. He admitted to attacking her, to beating her, to strangling her, and to dragging her body into the weeds. He gave a full confession. He and Karina had never known each other. There was no history between them, no argument, no relationship of any kind. He had seen a woman running alone, and he had made a decision that ended her life and destroyed his own. He was arraigned on February 5th, 2017. Kathy Vetrano was present in the courtroom that day. Seeing the man charged with her daughter's murder for the first time in a formal legal setting, she used the word she had already used in public, demon. Lewis was charged with 4 counts. 1 count of first-degree murder, 2 counts of second-degree murder, and 1 count of first-degree sexual assault. He pleaded not guilty. A trial date was set. The first trial began in the autumn of 2018, before Justice Michael Alloys in Queens Supreme Court. For days, the jury heard the DNA evidence, the confession, the forensic detail assembled from the crime scene. The prosecution's case was built on what they believed was an overwhelming foundation: a complete DNA match, a detailed admission by the defendant in his own words. The defense challenged the reliability of Lewis's confession, arguing that it had been obtained under circumstances that made its validity questionable. They questioned police procedure. They raised doubt about the conditions of the interrogation. The jury deliberated for 13 hours. They could not agree. 7 voted guilty. 5 voted not guilty. Justice Alloys declared a mistrial. The Queens District Attorney's Office announced immediately that they would retry the case. Lewis remained in custody. His next court date was set for January 2019. For the Vetrano family, the mistrial was a wound on top of a wound, a legal outcome that forced them back into the process they had already endured, that required them to sit in a courtroom once more and hear, again, the evidence of what had been done to their daughter, while the man charged with doing it remained alive and present and pleading not guilty. The second trial began in March 2019. A new jury was seated. The same evidence was presented: the DNA, the confession, the forensic detail, the account of Phil Vetrano finding his daughter in the marsh grass. Lewis's attorney, Robert Moeller, challenged the confession again, argued for acquittal, and asked the jury to look past the emotional weight of the evidence and consider whether a reasonable doubt existed. The prosecution, led by Queens Assistant District Attorney Michael Curtis, asked the jury to do what the first jury had failed to do: to look at the evidence in its totality and deliver the verdict that the facts demanded. Closing arguments were delivered on the morning of March 31st, 2019. Shortly after 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the jury began deliberating. They deliberated for less than 5 hours. At approximately 9 o'clock in the evening on April 1st, 2019, the jury returned to the courtroom and delivered their verdict on all 4 counts. The reaction from the Vetrano side of the courtroom was described by reporters who were present as thunderous, an eruption of sound that had been building for 2.5 years, since the moment Phil Vetrano had found his daughter's body in the weeds of Spring Creek Park. Guilty, on every count: first-degree murder, second-degree murder twice, first-degree sexual assault. Chanel Lewis, 22 years old, was a convicted murderer. Outside the courtroom, Phil Vetrano spoke to the gathered reporters. His voice, which had been the voice of a father who had spent nearly 3 years searching for justice for a daughter he had found dead in the park where they used to run together, was steady with the particular calm of a man who had reached the end of a long and terrible road. "Justice has been served," he said. It was a statement that contained multitudes: the relief, the grief that relief could not fully displace, the knowledge that nothing the legal system could produce would bring Karina back, and the recognition that what had just happened in that Queen's courtroom was the closest thing to justice that the law was capable of providing. Sentencing was scheduled for April 17, 2019. In the days between the verdict and the sentencing, New York state law required the court to formally consider whether Chanel Lewis should receive life in prison with or without the possibility of parole. For first-degree murder in New York, the maximum available sentence was life without parole, permanent incarceration, the full weight of the law brought to bear on an act that the legal system had determined was not compatible with any future release. Prosecutor Shane Young asked the judge to impose the maximum. On April 22, 2019, Justice Alois sentenced Chanel Lewis to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He was 22 years old. He would die in prison. He would grow old within the institutional walls of the New York State correctional system, moving through decades that Karina Vetrano would never see. The seasons changing outside windows he could look through but not step past. The years accumulating into a lifetime spent in the consequence of a single evening in August 2016, when he had seen a woman running alone and made the decision that destroyed them both. For Phil and Kathy Vetrano, the sentence closed the legal chapter of their daughter's story. But it did not close the grief, which does not follow legal calendars or respect the tidy resolutions of courtroom proceedings. The Spring Creek Park where Karina had run, where she had jogged beside her father through seasons of ordinary happiness, continued to exist, the same path through the same marsh grass, the same reeds bending in the same bay wind. The Vetranos continued to live in Howard Beach, in the neighborhood where Karina had grown up and where she had built the life that was taken from her. The case became, in the years after the conviction, part of a larger conversation about women's safety in public spaces, about the specific vulnerability that a woman running alone in a park represents, not because she has done anything wrong, not because she has misjudged her environment, but simply because she is a woman, and because not every person who uses a public path means her well. Karina Vetrano had done nothing unusual. She had gone for a jog in a park she knew and trusted, a park she had run through hundreds of times. The fact that she was alone on that particular evening was a coincidence of timing. Her father's sore back, a random Tuesday, a spontaneous decision. She had lived 30 years safely in Howard Beach. She had been 30 years old, a speech therapist with a career and a family who loved her and a full life ahead of her. The DNA beneath her fingernails told the truest story of who Karina Vetrano was in the moment that mattered most. She had fought. She had scratched and clawed and bitten even as she was dying. She had refused to go quietly. The biological material she collected under her fingernails in those final moments, the material that matched the man convicted of her murder, that survived his attempt to disappear, that formed the foundation of the case that eventually put him in prison for life, was her final act. It was a form of testimony given under the most extreme possible circumstances. It was the speech therapist who spent her life helping others find their voice, finding her own one last time in the most desperate possible way. Spring Creek Park still stretches along the edge of Howard Beach. The marsh grass still moves in the wind off Jamaica Bay. Joggers still run the paths in the mornings and evenings, the way people have always done in cities where parks offer the closest thing to open country. The spot where Karina Vetrano was found, 15 feet from the trail in the weeds, is a place like any other place in a park, unmarked, ordinary, indistinguishable from the rest of the landscape unless you know what happened there. But the people who know, her father Phil, her mother Kathy, every person who loved her, and every person who has since learned her name, carry the knowledge of it with them always, a permanent addition to the map of a neighborhood and a city and a world that she deserved to live in much, much longer. Story 2. Nelson County, Kentucky, sits in the heart of the bluegrass country that gives this part of the American South its identity. Rolling farmland, stretches of dark fence line dividing horse pastures, and the quiet, unhurried rhythm of a community where people have known each other for generations. Bardstown, the county seat, is a small city of fewer than 15,000 people, the kind of place where faces are familiar and reputations travel quickly. It is famous, among other things, for its bourbon distilleries, ancient, wood-fragrant buildings where Kentucky's most celebrated spirit ages in the dark. But in the summer of 2015, Bardstown became known for something else entirely. The disappearance of a mother of 5 who vanished on the 4th of July weekend, and whose case would unravel, over the course of a decade, into one of the most chilling and far-reaching murder investigations in the state's recent history. Crystal Rogers was 35 years old. She had 5 children, a fact that defined her daily existence in the most fundamental way, that gave her mornings their shape and her evenings their purpose. She was dark-haired and warm-faced, the kind of woman whose presence was felt in a room, whose absence would be impossible to miss. She was known among her family and friends as someone direct and full of life, someone who loved her children with a completeness that those around her could witness plainly. She had been through difficulties in her life, as most people have by 35, but in the summer of 2015 she was building something, a relationship, a household, a future. Her boyfriend was a man named Brooks Houck, and they lived together in Bardstown with her children. He was the last person who ever saw her alive. The evening of July 3rd, 2015, was an ordinary Friday night by every visible measure. The 4th of July weekend had begun, and across Nelson County, families were making their plans, cookouts, fireworks, the slow and celebratory ease of an American summer holiday. Brooks Houck later told that he and Crystal had spent the evening at his family's farm on Pascal Ballard Lane, a property in the county's rural outskirts. They arrived there, he said, at around 8 in the evening and stayed until midnight, before returning together to their home in Bardstown. He said that when they arrived home, Crystal was awake, sitting in the dim glow of her phone, playing a game. He went to bed. He said he fell asleep, and when he woke the following morning, she was gone. That was his account. It was the account he gave police, and would maintain through years of investigation. But from the earliest stages of the inquiry, the evidence did not match the story. Phone records quickly became one of the most significant threads in the investigation. When detectives examined Crystal's cell phone data, they found something that directly contradicted Houck's version of events. According to the records, Crystal's phone had gone dark, had effectively died, at 9:23 in the evening on July 3rd, while she and Houck were supposedly still at the family farm. That was nearly 3 hours before Houck claimed they had returned home. The phone had briefly turned on again at 11:57 at night, before being manually switched off, shut down by a deliberate act rather than a depleting battery. After that, it never turned on again. Crystal Rogers, as far as the digital record was concerned, ceased to exist just after midnight on July 4th, 2015. When Crystal's family realized she was missing, they did what families in crisis do. They looked for her. They called everyone they could think of. They tried her phone. They asked her friends. And then, on July 5th, 2 days after she had last been seen, they walked into the Nelson County Sheriff's office and reported her missing. The initial response was not what the family had hoped for. Crystal had been gone less than 48 hours, and without immediate evidence of foul play, the early stages of the investigation were frustratingly slow. But the family was not slow. They were mobilized, determined, and absolutely certain from the very beginning that something terrible had happened to their daughter and sister. At the center of that family's grief and its determination stood a man named Tommy Ballard, Crystal's father. Tommy was a hunter, a tough and plain-spoken man of the Kentucky countryside who channeled his anguish in the only way he knew how, by taking action. He pursued leads, gathered information, spoke to anyone who would listen, and kept the public pressure on investigators to treat his daughter's disappearance as the crime he believed it to be. He became the public face of the family's campaign for justice, a father who refused to accept silence, who placed the weight of his will against the institutional resistance of a system that had not yet committed fully to the truth that Tommy already carried in his chest. The physical investigation produced its first significant lead not from anything high-tech or sophisticated, but from a pair of men out hunting on a summer night. Daniel Donahue and Ryan Cecil had been on a property adjacent to the Houck family farm on the evening of July 3rd, 2015. In the darkness, in the rain, they had spotted a white Buick LeSabre parked on a gravel path near the farm. They thought it was strange, late, wet, an unusual place for a car to be sitting. Donahue approached it and peered inside. He saw a fleece jacket and a water bottle. The car had Nelson County plates. He remembered it, And when, months later, Crystal's father Tommy posted on social media asking for information about a white Buick connected to his daughter's disappearance, Donahue and Cecil came forward. That car became the single most important physical object in the entire investigation. The white Buick LeSabre belonged to Anna Whitesides, the grandmother of Brooks Houck. Police went to Whitesides' home with a search warrant and found a different car, a 2012 Mazda, with a temporary tag. Whitesides told investigators she had sold the Buick. What followed was a revelation that spoke directly to the desperation and guilt of someone who knew what that car contained. The Buick had been taken to a car dealership in Louisville. Not just any dealership, but Town and Country Ford. Just 4 days after Tommy Ballard had publicly posted his request for information about it. Someone had moved quickly to get rid of the vehicle, and the way they had tried to get rid of it was itself deeply revealing. Keith Stivers, a sales manager at Sternberg Automobile, was the man who encountered Nick Houck, Brooks Houck's brother, and Anna Whitesides when they arrived to trade in the car. He described the interaction as very, very unusual. Nick Houck had been utterly clear. He would not hand over the keys. He would not allow the dealership to inspect the vehicle. He would not permit anyone to look inside it before any agreement was made. He wanted it gone without examination. Stivers declined the trade. The Buick was eventually taken to a police impound lot in Louisville. When investigators finally got inside it, no blood or bodily fluids were found. But in the trunk, on the left side, in a location consistent with the transport of a person, a single hair was found. DNA analysis confirmed that the hair matched the profile of Crystal Rogers. A cadaver dog named Ranger was brought to the impound lot in Louisville in May 2016. His handler, Terry Benjamin, was the owner of Lone Star Search and Rescue in Texas. A man brought in specifically because he was independent, because he had no knowledge of the case, and because his dog's alert would therefore be uncontaminated by suggestion. Ranger was led through a blind search of the impound lot. He moved among the vehicles with the focused, purposeful energy of a trained animal, and then he found the white Buick and gave his final trained alert. Human remains had been in that car. The trunk of a vehicle belonging to Brooks Houck's grandmother, driven to a dealership for emergency disposal within days of Crystal's father asking questions publicly, had carried the scent of a dead person. Nick Houck, Brooks Houck's brother and a Bardstown police officer at the time of Crystal's disappearance, became central to the investigation in a second, chilling way. His then-girlfriend, Amber Bowman, testified in court about his movements on July 3rd and 4th, 2015. Nick Houck had woken early on the morning of July 3rd and left the house, telling Bowman he was going to help his brother with rental properties. He never came home that night. His phone had been switched off, completely dark, from July 2nd until early on July 4th. Bowman called him 15 times in the space of 24 hours. None of the calls were answered. A Bardstown police officer, a man with a badge and a knowledge of how investigations work, had his phone turned off for the entirety of the night on which Crystal Rogers disappeared. The investigation moved outward like ripples in water, each new detail connected to the last, each piece of evidence adding to a picture that was becoming unmistakable even as it remained, in a strictly legal sense, circumstantial. Joseph Lawson, 34 years old and a former employee of Brooks Houck's construction company, was identified as a second suspect. Lawson's father, Steve Lawson, 60, became the third. They formed a layered conspiracy. Brooks at the center, the man who prosecutors believed had ordered or committed the murder. Joseph as the active participant. Steve as the one who helped manage the physical aftermath. Specifically, investigators alleged, in moving Crystal's vehicle and concealing the evidence of her death. And then, on a November morning in 2016, the case was struck by a second catastrophe. Tommy Ballard, Crystal's father, the man who had spent over a year as his daughter's most relentless public advocate, who had gathered leads and questioned witnesses and posted on social media and refused to let the world move on, was shot and killed on a family property off the Bluegrass Parkway. He was killed while out hunting, and the initial report from police called his death a hunting accident. His family did not believe that for a single moment. Tommy Ballard had been the most dangerous person to whoever had killed Crystal Rogers. Not because he had the legal authority of an investigator, but because he had the motivated, tireless energy of a bereaved father who would not stop asking questions. He was shot, and then his death was called an accident. His family was left with 2 murders, only one of which had even been classified as a murder. The FBI eventually reviewed Tommy Ballard's case and reclassified his death as a homicide. The connection between his killing and the Rogers investigation began to emerge in the courtroom proceedings years later. Prosecutor Shane Young would tell a judge that a rifle had been purchased from Nick Houck, Brooks Houck's brother, the police officer whose phone had been off the night Crystal disappeared, through the use of a false name. Undercover FBI agents had acquired the weapon. Early forensic testing matched the rifle to 4 out of 5 criteria for the weapon used to kill Tommy Ballard. Nick Houck has not been charged in Tommy Ballard's killing. But the alignment of the evidence, the dead woman's father, the brother of the man convicted of her murder, the rifle sold under a false name, sits in the record of the case like a shadow that has not yet fully resolved into shape. It took 8 years after Crystal's disappearance before Brooks Houck, Steve Lawson, and Joseph Lawson were finally arrested. 8 years of investigation, of evidence gathering, of forensic analysis and surveillance, and federal involvement. The Nelson County Sheriff's Office, working alongside the FBI and state investigators, had rebuilt the case piece by painstaking piece. There was no body. Crystal Rogers has never been found. Her remains, like so many victims of intimate partner violence who are killed and then hidden, have not been recovered. What the prosecution was bringing to trial in June 2025 was a no-body homicide case, one of the most difficult categories of prosecution in American criminal law. Built entirely on circumstantial evidence, timelines, phone records, a single hair, a cadaver dog, and 10 years of accumulated investigative detail. The trial of Brooks Houck and Joseph Lawson began on June 24, 2025, in Nelson County Circuit Court, before Judge Charles Sims III. A jury of 15, including 3 alternates, was seated. For days, they heard testimony from detectives, forensic specialists, phone records analysts, the coon hunters who had seen the white Buick in the rain, the car salesman who had refused to trade it in without looking inside, the cadaver dog handler who described Ranger's alert at the impound lot. They heard about the inconsistencies in Houck's timeline. The phone records showing Crystal's phone dying at 9:23 while she and Houck were supposedly still on the farm together. The phone briefly reactivating at 11:57 and then being manually switched off forever. They heard from Amber Bowman about Nick Houck's 15 unanswered calls and his 2-day phone blackout. Prosecutor Shane Young told the jury plainly, and without apology, this was a circumstantial case. There was no physical evidence directly placing Houck at the moment of Crystal's death. But, he argued, the circumstantial evidence, taken in its totality, told a story that could not be explained by innocence. The defense, led by Houck's attorney Brian Butler, pushed back with the force of everything available to them. He pointed at the absence of physical evidence. He argued that investigators had faced immense public pressure to solve a high-profile case and had made missteps across nearly a decade of investigation. He spent $37,000 on expert witnesses, a cognitive psychologist, a former state representative, a K-9 handler, each deployed to chip away at the credibility of the prosecution's evidence. The cadaver dog's training records had been lost in a 2017 move. The single hair in the trunk could not place Crystal's death in that vehicle with absolute certainty. The case, Butler argued, was not proof, it was pressure dressed up as evidence. Judge Sims denied the defense's motion to dismiss the indictments. The jury received closing statements, and on July 7, 2025, they delivered their verdict. Brooks Houck was found guilty of complicity to commit murder and evidence tampering. Joseph Lawson was found guilty of conspiracy to commit murder and evidence tampering. His father, Stephen Lawson, had already been convicted in May in a separate trial. Three men guilty. A woman who had been missing for 10 years, finally acknowledged by the law as a murder victim. The sentencing hearing that followed on September 17, 2025, was a room full of grief that had been accumulating for a decade. Crystal's mother, Sherry Ballard, stood before Judge Sims and addressed Brooks Houck directly. She had waited 10 years for this moment, 10 years in which she had lost not only her daughter but her husband, shot to death in a field while fighting for answers that the legal system had not yet been ready to provide. She spoke with the contained, determined force of a woman who has survived things that would destroy most people, and she spoke directly to the man who had been convicted of complicity in her daughter's murder. Judge Charles Sims handed down the sentences. Brooks Houck received life in prison, the maximum available under Kentucky law, with the possibility of parole after 20 years. Joseph Lawson received 25 years, also a maximum. Steve Lawson had previously received 17 years. Three members of an interlocking network of complicity and concealment, sentenced to a combined total of decades behind bars. And yet the case was not complete. Crystal Rogers has still not been found. Wherever she is, beneath some field in Nelson County, in the dark earth of the bluegrass country she had lived in and known, she has not been brought home. Her children, the 5 young people whose lives she had shaped with her love and her presence, have grown up without her. They have passed 10 years of birthdays and Christmases and ordinary Tuesdays without the woman who had given them everything they knew of safety and belonging. Tommy Ballard's murder remains officially unsolved. Nick Houck, whose phone was off, whose name appears tied to the rifle potentially used to kill his daughter's father, has not been charged with anything. The family, speaking after the sentencing, made clear they intend to attend every parole hearing for the 3 convicted men. They also made clear they have not stopped seeking justice for Tommy. Sherry Ballard, Crystal's mother, emerged from this decade of catastrophe. 2 murders, 1 unsolved. A daughter's remains never recovered. A legal system that took 8 years to make its first arrests, with something that looks, from the outside, like extraordinary resilience. She had not been broken. She had been altered, in the way that loss alters people permanently and completely, but she had not been destroyed. Crystal Rogers was 35 years old when she disappeared on a July night in Bardstown, Kentucky. She left behind 5 children and a father who died fighting for her. She left behind a mother who kept fighting for 10 more years after that. She left behind a case that became, in the end, the story of what is possible when a family refuses to accept silence. When the grief that should have broken them became instead the force that drove them forward, season after season, through a decade of court hearings and investigative dead ends and unimaginable personal loss, until the day that a jury in a Nelson County courtroom finally spoke the word that she had deserved all along. Guilty. Story 3. The morning of February 4th, 2015, arrived in Robeson County, North Carolina, the way winter mornings often do in that part of the world. Quiet and gray, the air cool and still, the pine trees standing like patient sentinels along the rural roads that cut through the flatlands of the county. For most people in the small town of Fairmont, it was an ordinary Wednesday. They would dress for the day, pour their coffee, and begin another unremarkable rotation of ordinary life. But for one young woman in that community, it was the last morning she would ever live. And for the people who loved her, it was the last moment they would ever be whole. Sarah Nicole Graham was 18 years old, and by the accounts of every person who knew her, she carried a warmth into the world that was genuinely rare. She was 5 feet 4 inches tall, with dark brown hair and brown eyes, and she wore glasses and braces, small details that somehow made her seem younger and more fragile in retrospect, though those who knew her best would be quick to correct that impression. Sarah was not fragile. She was an artist. She would make handmade gifts for her friends, carefully crafted with her own hands, given not out of obligation but out of a genuine, quiet devotion to the people she cared about. She loved animals with the passionate, uncomplicated affection of someone who could not bear to see anything suffer. Sarah was Native American, part of the indigenous community that has long been one of the defining cultural presences of Robeson County, a county that carries within it a complicated and often painful history. She had not always lived in North Carolina. She had moved from Texas to be with her father, Hubert Graham, who was a sergeant in the Robeson County Sheriff's Office, a man with a badge, a profession built on the premise of protecting others. Hubert had remarried, and so Sarah came not just to a new state, but to a new household, one that included her stepmother, Connie Graham. On that Wednesday morning, Sarah woke up as she always did and prepared for her shift. She worked at Walmart in Pembroke, a town not far from Fairmont, and her commute was typically around 20 minutes, a short, familiar drive along the straightforward roads of Robeson County. She left the house on Centerville Church Road at approximately 6:30 in the morning, heading toward Pembroke in her white Chevrolet Astro van. Her shift was scheduled to begin at 7. She had done this drive before. She knew the roads. She was simply going to work. She never arrived. Within the next 15 minutes, Sarah's white van was spotted parked in a wheat field just a few minutes from her house, off East McDonald Road. It was locked. There were no signs of a struggle around it. There were no signs of Sarah in or around the vehicle. It sat in that field like a question with no visible answer. A vehicle abandoned in a place and a manner that made no immediate sense, that refused to resolve into an innocent explanation, no matter how hard people tried to construct one. By midday, when Sarah had not appeared at work and had not been heard from, the alarm spread. The Fairmont Police Department initiated a search. It was not a small effort. Local volunteers turned out to help, along with 9 units trained to find what human eyes cannot. They searched fields, tree lines, drainage ditches, and the area surrounding McDonald Road. The county threw its collective effort into finding the young woman who had simply disappeared between her house and the road that led to her job. They found nothing. Sarah Graham had vanished completely, and the only thing that remained was the locked white van sitting in a field, absorbing the winter light, offering nothing. The circumstances of her disappearance drew attention to the household she had come from that very morning. Sarah had been living with her father and her stepmother, both of whom were Robeson County deputies. It was a detail that layered a particular complexity onto an already difficult investigation. Connie Graham was not a stranger to law enforcement. She was law enforcement. She wore a badge. She understood how investigations worked. She knew the protocols, and within the early days and weeks of Sarah's disappearance, investigators and federal agents who had joined the inquiry began to turn their attention toward the woman inside that house. Sources close to the investigation, speaking to WRAL News in the weeks following Sarah's disappearance, confirmed that the FBI, which had joined the investigation early in the case, considered Connie Graham a suspect. It was not a conclusion that arrived casually. It arrived through the steady accumulation of details that did not add up, through timelines that contained gaps, through the specific nature of the evidence, or rather, the conspicuous absence of evidence, in a case where a young woman had simply ceased to exist. But suspicion is not proof, and in the years that followed Sarah's disappearance, the investigation moved forward without producing the concrete evidence needed to bring charges. Sarah's case was entered into the National Missing Persons Database. It was listed with the FBI. It gathered the weight of public attention at certain intervals, on anniversaries, during awareness campaigns, whenever advocates for missing Indigenous women raised their voices about the particular vulnerability of Native women in America, a vulnerability that the statistics had long described, and that Sarah's case seemed to embody in the most painful possible way. The years passed, and Sarah did not come home. For the people who loved her, each passing year was its own kind of grief. There was no grave to visit, no confirmed ending around which to build any semblance of closure. Sarah's biological mother, whose name and identity remained shielded from public scrutiny in the interest of her privacy, carried the weight of not knowing what had happened to her child for a decade. Her other children grew up with that void, a sister who had gone to North Carolina and never come back, a presence in the family defined entirely by absence. There were no answers, only the ongoing plea that anyone with information should come forward. Someone, investigators consistently maintained, knew something. Someone had always known something. And whoever that person was, they had been silent for years. Sheriff Bernice Wilkins took office in 2018, 3 years after Sarah disappeared. He would later say, in the formal statement announcing the arrests, that one of his very first priorities when he assumed the position was getting justice for Sarah Graham. He meant it. His office, in conjunction with the FBI's Charlotte Field office, continued the investigation through the years of his tenure, conducting fresh interviews, revisiting leads that had been set aside, applying new forensic technologies to evidence that had been gathered earlier in the case. In 2023, 8 years after Sarah vanished, investigators returned to the Fairmont area home with search warrants. They looked again. They were following recent leads, sheriff's officials said at the time. While most of the people we have interviewed have been cooperative, Sheriff Wilkins said during that 2023 search, we believe someone very close to her isn't telling us everything they know. It was a statement that carried a specific directional weight. Someone close to her, not a stranger. Not a predator who had appeared on a dark road. Someone who existed within the inner circle of Sarah Graham's daily life. Someone who had known her, had eaten breakfast in proximity to her, had shared the same address. Someone who had, perhaps, watched her leave the house that morning. The investigation continued to evolve as forensic science itself evolved. Sheriff Wilkins would later speak carefully about this, that as science continues to evolve, so does our ability to uncover evidence that may not have been available years ago. It is a statement that says something important about what happened in this case. The passage of time did not erode the investigation. It deepened it. New techniques, new analyses, new ways of examining old evidence gradually assembled a picture that the technology of 2015 could not have fully captured. The patience of the investigation, its refusal to close or go cold despite the absence of a body, became the foundation on which justice would eventually be built. In February 2026, Sarah's biological mother took a step that speaks to the particular and devastating position that families of the long missing occupy. She filed a petition with a North Carolina court, filed it on February 4, 2026, exactly 11 years to the date of Sarah's disappearance, asking that her daughter be legally declared dead. She was not giving up. She was not surrendering the grief or abandoning the search for truth. She was following the law, navigating the system, using the only legal pathway available to her. North Carolina state law allows a missing person to be presumed dead after 7 years of continuous absence and silence. Sarah had been gone for 11. The filing said, in the measured language of legal documents, no communication has been received from Sarah Nicole Graham, nor has there been any verified evidence that the person is alive since February 4th, 2025. 11 years. A declaration in a courthouse that a daughter, a sister, a friend, a young woman who made handmade gifts and loved animals and wore a smile wherever she went, was legally no longer considered among the living. On June 1st, 2026, the court granted the petition. Sarah Graham was officially declared dead. That legal declaration, painful as it was not an ending. It was, as Sheriff Wilkins would later explain, a necessary step, a procedural threshold that North Carolina law required before certain criminal charges could be filed. A judge had to determine, as a matter of fact before a court, that Sarah was deceased. Only after that determination could prosecutors move forward with the charges that investigators had been building toward for over a decade. On June 25, 2026, 24 days after Sarah was declared dead by a court, the Robeson County Sheriff's Office moved. 3 arrests were made. Federal and local authorities worked together. The culmination of 11 years of investigation, surveillance, interviews, forensic work, and quiet persistence. Connie Graham, 65 years old, the stepmother who had shared a home with Sarah Graham on the last morning of Sarah's life, was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. She was also charged with 2 counts of felony conspiracy and with altering, stealing, and destroying criminal evidence. Also arrested were two of Connie Graham's adult sons. Bobby Matthew McClellan, 42 years old, from Lumberton, was charged with accessory after the fact, felony conspiracy, and altering, stealing, and destroying criminal evidence. According to arrest warrants, McClellan's specific role had been in the disposal of Sarah's remains. His younger brother, Luke Locklear, 29 years old, also from Lumberton, was charged with felony conspiracy and with destroying evidence, the arrest warrant specifying that Locklear had taken items from the home and burned them. The items were not incidental. They were a bed, clothing, and flooring, the physical record of what had happened inside that house. The picture assembled by the charges was devastating in its completeness. Sarah Graham had not vanished into the unknown on a winter morning in 2015. She had been killed inside the house she shared with her father and stepmother. The woman charged with her murder had then organized a cover-up, deploying her own children to help conceal what she had done. One son carried the body away. The other burned what was left behind: the mattress that would have held forensic evidence, the clothing, the flooring that had absorbed whatever the killing had left in the room. The white van had been placed in the wheat field on East McDonald Road, not because of a carjacking or a stranger abduction, but as part of the staging, to make it appear that Sarah had driven somewhere and disappeared, that the story of her vanishing had begun on a road rather than inside a home. Sarah's father, Hubert Graham, the man whose career had been devoted to the sheriff's office, the man who had brought his daughter from Texas to live in North Carolina, was not among those charged. What he knew, what he had known, what he had chosen to believe or not believe over the course of 11 years, those questions belonged now to the long and complicated shadow of the case. The formal investigation had established its probable cause, and it pointed at his wife and her sons. His own silence filled the space around that fact. Connie Graham was denied bond entirely. She was held without the possibility of release as she awaited trial, a judge's determination that the weight of the charges and the circumstances of the case made her a risk that no bond amount could adequately address. Her sons, Bobby McClellan and Luke Locklear, were each held under a bond of $1 million, a figure that reflected the severity of their alleged participation in what the prosecution was characterizing as a coordinated, deliberate effort to conceal a murder from justice for more than a decade. There remained, as the arrests were announced, one devastating open wound in the case. Sarah's body had still not been found. She had been missing for over 11 years. The woman charged with killing her had organized the disposal of her remains, and wherever Sarah now rested, that location was known to the people who had put her there and not to anyone else. The FBI announced a reward of $5,000 for any information leading to Sarah's location. It was an appeal to the conscience of whoever was still protecting that secret, an acknowledgement that the truth of where Sarah was had not yet been fully retrieved, even as the truth of what had been done to her had finally been brought into the legal light. Robeson County District Attorney's Office was preparing for what prosecutors and legal observers recognized as an extraordinarily difficult kind of trial, a no-body homicide case. These cases are genuinely rare. Without a body, there is no medical examiner's report. There is no forensic autopsy, no cause of death established through direct examination of physical remains. The entire architecture of the prosecution would need to be constructed from other evidence, from timelines, witness testimony, forensic analysis of the destroyed evidence, and the accumulated investigative work of 11 years. Sarah's biological mother, through her attorney, released a statement after the arrests that was measured and grief-drenched in equal measure. "The last 11 years have been tremendously difficult," she said. "Not a day goes by that my other children, and I don't think about Sarah. We miss her terribly. After more than a decade since Sarah's disappearance, the decision to seek a court order to have her declared deceased was incredibly painful, but something we felt we needed to do." She thanked the Robeson County Sheriff's Office, the FBI, and the District Attorney's Office for their persistence. And then she repeated, one final time, the plea that had been going out since February 2015. We echo the plea that we have made since 2015, that anyone with information about Sarah's disappearance should come forward and share that information with law enforcement. Somewhere in Robeson County, or perhaps beyond it, Sarah Graham rests in a place that the people who put her there hoped would never be found. The investigation that finally reached Connie Graham after 11 years is not finished. It will not be finished until the young woman who made handmade gifts for her friends and loved animals and left her house with a smile on an ordinary February morning is brought back to the people who never stopped looking for her. 11 years of searching. 11 years of vigils and pink ribbons and court filings and search warrants and forensic science growing more precise with every passing season. 11 years of a mother waking up each morning and carrying the weight of not knowing. 11 years of a sheriff's office refusing to let a young woman's case go quiet. And in the end, the truth did not disappear with Sarah's body. It stayed, embedded in the evidence of a burned bed, a destroyed floor, the soil of a field where a van had been abandoned as a decoy, and in the conscience of the people who had carried their secret for more than a decade. Justice for Sarah Graham is still unfolding. The trial lies ahead. The search for her remains continues. But on June 25, 2026, the long silence was finally broken, and the name Connie Graham was spoken in a courtroom, attached to a charge, held to account for the first time since the morning she allegedly took the life of the young woman who had simply come to North Carolina to be with her father. Sarah Nicole Graham was 18 years old. She was an artist. She was kind. She loved animals. She wore a smile. And she deserved so much more than what she got. But she deserved, above all else, the truth. And after 11 years, the truth has begun to find its way home. Story 4. The French Alps, in the full warmth of July, are among the most beautiful places on earth. The mountains rise in great stone formations above the treeline. The air is clean and cool even in summer, and the narrow roads that wind between hamlets carry only the gentlest traffic. A car, a bicycle, a child playing. There is a particular quality of light in those mountains in the late afternoon, golden and generous, the kind that makes everything look safe and permanent, as though the world could not possibly contain anything dangerous within such a landscape. It is a light that deceives. The hamlet of Haute-Vernay sits in the Alpes de Haute province, in southeastern France, at an elevation of approximately 1,200 meters above sea level. It is not a village in any bustling sense of the word. It is more like a gathering of houses, 25 residents in total, a scattering of stone buildings, a narrow street that runs through the middle of the settlement like a single breath. Children play in the roads here because the roads are safe enough for it. Neighbors know each other. The mountains stand watch on every side. It is the kind of place that French families choose for summer holidays precisely because it feels removed from the weight of modern life, quiet, enclosed, and reassuring in its smallness. It was to this hamlet, on the morning of July 8, 2023, that a young mother named Marie Soleil brought her eldest child. Émile Soleil was 2.5 years old. He had been born on November 11, 2020, into a family that lived in La Bouladise, a town about 30 kilometers from Marseille. He had blonde hair and brown eyes, and he carried himself in the way that toddlers do, with a kind of determined, wobbling confidence, exploring the world at the edge of his understanding. He was, in the language of every parent who has ever loved a small child, everything. He was the particular kind of everything that arrives in a life before you even understand how permanent the love will become. His family had planned a holiday. Marie had brought Émile to spend time with her parents, his maternal grandparents, Philippe and Vedevini, who were staying at their summer home in Haute-Vernay, as they did each year. Émile's parents themselves were taking a brief break. It was an ordinary arrangement, the kind of thing that families across France do every summer. Grandparents and grandchildren, a holiday home in the mountains, a few days of fresh air and unhurried time. The morning passed without incident. Philippe Vedevini, the grandfather, a 59-year-old man, was at home along with his wife and 8 of their 10 children, whose ages ranged from 7 to 18. It was a full, busy household in the way that large families are. The younger members of the family had spent part of the morning building a cabin near the house, the kind of project that children devise for themselves in places with space and time, and no screens to pull their attention away. Emil had watched them, perhaps wanting to join, perhaps simply content to observe from the edges of the activity. Around 5 o'clock in the afternoon, the day shifted. Emil was in the garden, playing in the late afternoon sun, waiting to be taken for a walk. His grandfather, Philippe, was preparing to fence a meadow for his horses. He was loading stakes and electric wire into the trunk of his car. It was a practical, domestic moment. The grandfather was occupied. The household was alive with the scattered attention of a large family. And sometime in those minutes of distraction and ordinary activity, Emil wandered. He was wearing a yellow t-shirt and white shorts. He walked out of the garden and down the hamlet's single street, apparently heading in the direction where his young uncles and aunts had been building their cabin that morning. 2 neighbors saw him. According to the formal statements given to investigators, the witnesses observed Emil walking alone at around 5:15 in the afternoon, approximately 20 meters from his grandparents' home. They did not stop him. They did not alert anyone. In Haute-Vernay, it was common to see children playing unaccompanied in the narrow street. It was that kind of place, a place where the geography itself felt like a boundary, where the population of 25 made supervision feel redundant. No one could have imagined in that moment that what they were watching was the last time Emile Soleil would ever be seen alive. At approximately 5:15 in the afternoon, the boy was there. By 6:12 in the evening, after his family had searched for him for nearly an hour without success, his grandfather called the Alpes de Haute Province gendarmerie to report him missing. What followed was an effort of extraordinary scale for a hamlet that contained 25 people. By 6:40 that same evening, the emergency response had begun. The local fire brigade coordinated a search involving approximately 100 people from Haute-Vernay and neighboring villages. A helicopter flew patterns above the mountains, scanning the terrain with professional thoroughness. 3 gendarmerie dogs were deployed, trained animals whose sense of smell carries information that human investigators cannot directly access. The search ran through the night, ending at 3 in the morning without having found the boy. 12 hectares of land had been combed. Every meter of the immediate vicinity had been covered. Emile was not there. Sunday arrived. The public prosecutor of Digny-les-Bains, Remy Avon, launched an official appeal for witnesses. The appeal generated more than 1,400 reports. Most of them, when investigated, led to nothing. 200 volunteers joined the search that day. Drones and helicopters equipped with thermal cameras swept the mountainsides. Bloodhounds, among the most acute trackers in the world of search and rescue, were brought in. The bloodhounds found the child's scent in 2 places, both within a radius of 20 meters of the family house. Then they found nothing. The trail stopped as abruptly as if it had been erased. The general of the gendarmerie, Jacques-Charles Fombon, noted the significance of this finding. The dogs had tracked Emile to within 20 meters of the house, and then the scent vanished. This may mean, he said carefully, that at that moment the child got into a vehicle. It was not an accusation. It was an observation about the data. But the data was pointing toward a possibility that no one in those first hours of searching had been willing to fully voice. That Emile had not simply wandered away. That his disappearance had not been the accidental unfolding of a toddler exploring too far. That something else had happened in that garden on that golden afternoon. By Monday, 500 volunteers had joined the search. By Tuesday, investigators had searched every one of the 30 buildings that made up the hamlet of Haute-Vernay, visited 12 vehicles, questioned all 25 residents of the hamlet, and covered 97 hectares of land. But Emile was not found. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. A child who had been seen walking down a hamlet street in a yellow t-shirt and white shorts had simply ceased to exist in the physical world. There was no body. There were no remains. There was no final confirmation of anything. Only the absence, which is its own particular form of torment for the families and investigators who must live inside it. France watched this case with the kind of held-breath attention that only the disappearance of a very young child can produce. There was national grief in the headlines. There were vigils. There were competing theories circulating through the press and social media. Accident, abduction by a stranger, something closer to home. Every possibility was discussed, and none of them could be closed because there was no evidence to close them with. The mountains had absorbed whatever had happened, and they were not offering it back. Then, on the morning of March 30th, 2024, a hiker changed everything. She was walking on a narrow forest road in the vicinity of a wooded and rather steep area called Les Auches, located 1.7 kilometers from the hamlet of Haute-Vernay, a 25-minute walk for an adult. It was an area that investigators had previously searched. In the woods, she found something that stopped her cold. She gathered what she had found carefully, placed it in a plastic bag, and brought it to the gendarmerie. Inside the bag were bones, a skull and teeth belonging to a small child. The following day, April 1st, 2024, the public prosecutor of Aix-en province made the announcement that France had been dreading since the previous July. Genetic identification had confirmed what investigators feared. The bones were those of Émile Soleil. The search for a missing child had become a death investigation. The area around Les Auches was searched again with renewed intensity. On April 2nd, approximately 150 meters below the place where the skull had been found, investigators discovered clothing, a t-shirt, shoes, and underwear scattered across a stretch of about 10 meters. Then a small bone fragment. The clothing matched what Émile had been wearing on the day he disappeared, a yellow t-shirt. Initial examination of the skull noted post-mortem cracks, animal bites, and small fractures. Forensic scientists went to work on every piece of material evidence that had been found. What they found, and what they would later present with striking directness, would transform this case entirely. The bones told a story. It was not the story of an accidental fall. It was not the story of a toddler who had wandered into the wilderness and succumbed to the cold or the terrain. The skull of Émile Soleil showed traces of what forensic analysts described as violent facial trauma, specific, identifiable anatomical signs that were suggestive of a deliberate injury inflicted by another person. This was not the damage caused by a fall down a mountain or the decomposition and animal activity that naturally follows an unattended death in the wild. This was something else entirely. But there was another finding, perhaps even more significant in its implications. The evidence showed that the clothing and the bones discovered by the hiker had not been in that location since July 2023. They had been placed there recently, transported to Les Auches, and deposited shortly before the hiker found them in March 2024. The child's body, the analysis indicated, had not decomposed in the clothes found in the forest. It had been somewhere else, somewhere that investigators did not yet know, during the intervening months, and had then been moved to the wooded area where it was found, placed in a location that investigation teams had already searched and cleared. The implications of this were grave and specific. Someone had kept Émile's remains. Someone had known, for 9 months after his disappearance, where those remains were. And then someone had made a decision to place them in the forest, in a location already cleared by investigators, presumably in the hope that they would be found and absorbed into a narrative of accidental death, of a small boy who had wandered too far and perished in the wilderness. It was a calculated act, and it had nearly worked. The forensic picture that emerged, the violent facial trauma, the evidence of the remains having been moved and placed rather than found where the child had died, changed the entire orientation of the investigation. The possibility of an accident, of the boy simply wandering and falling, had become improbable. The investigation was now, firmly and formally, a murder inquiry. By early 2025, investigators from the National Investigation Unit, a dedicated team of approximately 15 specialists, had conducted 287 witness interviews. They had combed 285 hectares of terrain. They had analyzed 27 vehicles. They had processed 55 million bytes of communication data, including phone records and digital communications. 20 terabytes of data were still being analyzed. The investigation had become one of the most intensive in recent French criminal history for a child's case. Every lead, every physical trace, every digital footprint was being pursued with a thoroughness that bordered on the exhaustive. Then, before dawn on March 25, 2025, police moved. In simultaneous operations, officers conducted raids on two properties, a home in La Bouladise, the province village where the Vedavini family lived, and the hamlet of Haute-Vernay itself. 4 people were taken into custody. Émile's maternal grandparents, Philippe and Vedavini, aged 59, were arrested on suspicion of voluntary homicide and concealment of a corpse. 2 of their adult children, Émile's aunt and uncle, were arrested on the same allegations. A horse trailer and a car belonging to the grandfather were taken away for forensic investigation. The arrest of 4 family members, the grandparents who had been directly responsible for Émile on the day he disappeared, and 2 of their adult children, sent a seismic shock through both France and the international community following the case. As the 48-hour custody period ran its course, investigators subjected all 4 family members to intense interrogation. And then, on March 27th, all 4 were released. At a press conference following the releases, Prosecutor Blachin was careful and direct. The 4 had been freed, he said, because at the end of their custody, and in light of all the evidence gathered, there was insufficient evidence to bring any charges in this case. But he was equally clear about what that release did not mean. That does not mean it is definitively over, he said. New additional elements may arise during future investigations that are likely to extend it. The family line of investigation, he stated plainly, was not closed. The prosecutor also confirmed, for the first time publicly, the detail about the grandfather's past that had circulated in French media reports during the investigation. The earlier questioning had not resulted in formal charges that led to conviction, and the record was complex. But it was part of the picture that investigators had assembled, part of the context in which the family line of inquiry was being actively pursued even after the releases. The investigation, as of mid-2026, remains open. Émile Soleil has not received full justice. His killers, whoever they are, have not stood in a courtroom and been held to account. The case file sits in the hands of the investigating judges of AIXM province, and a national investigation unit continues to process data, pursue leads, and carry forward the work of establishing, with the certainty the law requires, what happened in the garden of a house in Haute-Vernay on the afternoon of July 8, 2023. What is known, because the prosecutors have said it in public, before cameras and reporters and the watching nation of France, is this: a 2.5-year-old boy in a yellow t-shirt walked away from his grandparents' home and was never seen alive again. His skull shows traces of violent facial trauma. His remains were moved and placed in the forest where they were eventually found. The evidence suggests the involvement of a third party. The body did not end up where it was found naturally. It was placed there, in a location already searched, by someone who knew what they were doing. The mountains above Haute-Vernay stand as they always have, massive, indifferent, older than the human dramas that unfold at their feet. They hold within their silences the story of what happened on a summer afternoon, in the golden light of a French July, to a small boy with blonde hair and brown eyes, who was wearing a yellow t-shirt. Somewhere in the record of those mountains, in the forensic data, and the witness interviews, and the 20 terabytes of digital communication still being analyzed, the full truth is embedded. Émile Soleil's parents wait for it. His country waits for it. And the investigators who have given years of their professional lives to this case continue, with the quiet and relentless persistence that justice demands, to work toward it. Day by day, piece by piece, until the boy in the yellow t-shirt finally receives what was taken from him along with his life. The truth spoken out loud, in a language that a court of law can hear. Story 5. Blackpool on the northwest coast of England. is a town that has always lived two lives simultaneously. The first is the life of lights, the famous illuminations that draw tourists from across the country every autumn, the towers and piers and fairground rides that light up the seafront and give the town the appearance of something perpetually celebrating. The second life, quieter and less photographed, belongs to the streets that run away from the seafront into the residential areas of the town, where ordinary families live in terraced houses and students catch buses to college in the morning, and mothers plan their children's futures with the uncomplicated confidence that those futures are safe. It was in this second Blackpool that Sasha Marsden grew up, and it was here, on a cold January night in 2013, that her future was stolen from her in an act of violence so extreme that those who investigated it would struggle for years to find language adequate to describe what had been done. Sasha was 16 years old. She was studying childcare at a local college, a choice that spoke directly to who she was. A young woman drawn instinctively toward care, toward nurturing, toward the protection of those who were smaller and more vulnerable. She lived with her family in Staining, a village on the outskirts of Blackpool, in a household that knew her laughter and her presence the way any home knows the person who fills it. She had two sisters, Katie and Gemma, who loved her with the specific, combative, and unbreakable affection that sisters carry for one another. She was a teenager in every ordinary sense of the word. She used social media, she looked for part-time work, she was building toward a life. She was 16, which means she was standing right at the edge of everything, just beginning to understand the shape of the adult world into which she was about to walk. But in the months before January 2013, something had already gone wrong in Sasha's world. 6 months before her death, she had gone missing from home and was found 6 days later in Lowestoft, Suffolk, more than 300 miles away. The details of that episode were never made fully public, but the fact of it existed as a shadow in the background of what followed. A teenager who had already experienced something frightening enough to cause her to disappear for nearly a week before being brought home. Whatever had happened, Sasha came back. And when she came back, she resumed her life, her college course, her family, the ordinary rhythm of a young woman with plans and dreams. She was trying to move forward. The name David Minto would have meant nothing to Sasha Marsden when it first appeared in her digital world. He was 22 years old, working as a caretaker at the Grafton House Hotel on Kirby Road, in Blackpool's South Shore district. The Grafton House was not a glamorous place. It was a modest guest house, functional rather than beautiful, one of the dozens of similar establishments that serve the town's tourism trade. Minto worked there, carried keys, fixed things, maintained the building, and had the run of the premises in the way that people entrusted with the upkeep of a building often do. He knew its rooms. He knew its corridors. He knew the alleyway that ran behind it, the one that backed onto the South Shore streets. What Minto did in the weeks before January 31st, 2013, was construct a trap. He reached out to Sasha, using the language of opportunity. He told her there was a job available, a cleaning position at the hotel, the kind of casual, entry-level work that a 16-year-old with bills to save for and independence to build would have found appealing. And Sasha, who was young enough and hopeful enough to take the offer at face value, agreed to come. She told her family she was going for a job interview. The morning of January 31st, 2013, was a Thursday. The winter light over Blackpool was thin and pale. Sasha got ready. She was going to the Grafton House Hotel on Kirby Road. It was not far. It was a familiar kind of place, the sort of building that exists in every British seaside town, unremarkable and unthreatening. Her family had no reason to stop her. She was 16, she was responsible, and she was going for a job interview at a local hotel. She was dropped off outside the Grafton House Hotel, said goodbye, and walked in through the front door. Inside the hotel, Minto was waiting. What happened next? That Minto had lured Sasha to the hotel with the deliberate intention of assaulting her. That everything that followed was the consequence of a plan. He took her inside. He assaulted her. And then, in an act of violence that lasted long enough to inflict 58 individual stab wounds on the body of a teenager, he killed her. She had fought. In the last moments of her life, with everything she had fought. When it was over, Minto was faced with what he had done and with the task of concealing it. He worked deliberately and with a kind of methodical coldness as one of the most disturbing aspects of the case. He wrapped Sasha's partially clothed body in carpet underlay, black bin liners, and bedding from the hotel. He carried her out of the building and into the alleyway that ran behind the Grafton house. He placed her there, in the narrow passage between the hotel's back wall and the rear yards of the neighboring street. And then he set her on fire. It was approximately 9 o'clock in the evening when the smoke detector inside the Grafton House Hotel was triggered. The alarm activated, guests and residents moved outside, and in the alleyway behind the building, a fire was burning. Those who saw it first thought they were looking at a mannequin. The wrapped, human-shaped form in the flickering light did not immediately resolve into the recognition of what it actually was. Some of them tried to put the fire out with bowls of water, carrying them from their rooms in an urgent, instinctive response to a fire they could not yet fully understand. Police arrived at approximately 9:15 in the evening. When the fire subsided, the truth of what lay in that alleyway became impossible to deny. It was a body. It was a girl. Detective Superintendent Andy Murphy of Lancashire Police stood before cameras in the hours that followed and spoke with the controlled, careful language of a senior investigator in the very first stage of a murder inquiry. "This is a murder investigation," he said, "and we are addressing the suspicious death of a 16-year-old girl. This case is exceptionally challenging and complex, and we are striving to piece together the events that transpired last night." He was right that it was challenging. The fire had done significant damage. The victim could not be identified by sight. It would take DNA testing, a comparison with DNA taken from Sasha's toothbrush at her family's home, to confirm formally who the girl in the alleyway had been. David Minto was arrested the same evening, shortly after the discovery of the body. A 20-year-old woman, also from the local area, was arrested alongside him the following day on suspicion of murder. She was Minto's girlfriend, and the hotel was owned by her mother. The woman was released without charge within days. The investigation concentrated entirely and permanently on Minto. The evidence was building with every hour. On February 3, 2013, 3 days after Sasha's body was found burning in the alley, David Minto was formally charged with her murder. He appeared in court the following day and was remanded in custody to await trial. He entered a plea of not guilty. The family Sasha had left behind moved through those weeks in the way that families of murder victims always must. In public, because the world is watching. In grief, because the loss has no edge. In the strange administrative reality of murder, which requires them to speak to police and solicitors and journalists and court officers, while simultaneously trying to contain an anguish that does not pause for any of it. Sasha's mother, her sisters Katie and Gemma, they carried Sasha with them into every press statement, every vigil, every day of a case that would take months to reach its resolution. The trial opened at Preston Crown Court on July 15, 2013. For 11 days, the jury heard the evidence assembled by Lancashire Police and the Crown Prosecution Service. They heard about the knife wounds and their precise distribution across Sasha's head, neck, and hands. They heard about the DNA evidence that linked Minto to the crime scene. They heard about the CCTV footage that captured elements of the timeline, Sasha arriving at the hotel, the movements that followed. They heard Peter Wright QC describe, with the measured authority of a barrister who has spent his career translating atrocity into legal language, what had happened inside the Grafton House Hotel on the evening of January 31st, 2013. He told the jury that this was not a random act. It was not an explosion of uncontrolled violence that no one could have predicted. It was, as the prosecution characterized it, a sexually motivated killing, planned and executed by a man who had deliberately used the trust of a 16-year-old girl to bring her to a place where he could act on intentions he had concealed behind the language of employment. David Minto took the witness stand in his own defense and told what Prosecutor Wright would describe as a series of lies. The defense could not undo the weight of the forensic evidence. It could not explain the 58 stab wounds. It could not account for the carpet underlay and the bin liners and the fire. The jury deliberated, and on July 26, 2013, they returned a unanimous verdict, guilty of murder. The sentencing took place the same day. The judge, considering the premeditated nature of the attack, the sexual motivation the prosecution had established, and the age and complete vulnerability of the victim, handed down a life sentence, the only sentence available for murder in England and Wales, with a minimum term of 35 years before Minto would be eligible for consideration for parole. It was one of the longest minimum terms ever handed down for a murder in Lancashire's legal history. He was 23 years old. He would not be eligible for parole consideration until he was well into his 50s. For Sasha's family, the sentence was significant. It was also, in their view, not enough. What they had wanted, what they continued to campaign for in the years following the trial, was a whole life order. The sentence that means no possibility of parole ever. A whole life order is reserved, under English law, for the most extreme cases, serial killers, terrorist attacks, the crimes that the courts determine represent such an extraordinary danger that no period of time could justify the possibility of release. The judge had not given Minto a whole life order, and that gap between what the family had hoped for and what the law had delivered became the foundation of their ongoing campaign. Minto, from prison, appealed his sentence in February 2014. He argued that 35 years was too long, that the minimum term should be reduced. The Court of Appeal of England and Wales heard the case and rejected the appeal. The 35-year minimum was upheld in full. But Sasha's sisters did not stop there. Katie Brett and Gemma Atchison, the two women who had grown up with Sasha, who had been present in her life in all the ways that sisters are present, who had sat in a courtroom in Preston and listened to the forensic account of what had been done to their little sister, became advocates. They campaigned not just for Minto specifically, but for a systemic change in English law. The right for victims' families to appeal against murder sentences that they believe are insufficiently severe. Under the current law in England, prosecutors have a 28-day window in which to challenge a sentence as unduly lenient, but no formal mechanism exists for families to independently pursue such a challenge. Katie and Gemma argued, publicly and persistently, that this was a gap in the system that needed to be closed, that the people who loved a victim deserved the same legal standing to contest a sentence as the person who had committed the crime. As recently as March 2025, Katie Brett was still speaking about this campaign. 12 years had passed since Sasha was killed in that alleyway. Katie was still fighting. Dangerous people are being freed from prisons, she said, and families need the ability to contest when perpetrators do not receive a whole life sentence. It was not bitterness for its own sake. It was the specific, focused advocacy of a woman who had spent over a decade watching the legal calendar count down toward the date when the man who murdered her sister might one day walk before a parole board and make his case for release. The case of Sasha Marsden carries within it several of the most pressing questions that the British legal system has been grappling with in the years since 2013. It is a case about online safety and the particular vulnerability of young people to manipulation via social media platforms, where anyone can construct an identity and an offer, where a 16-year-old looking for work can receive a message from a person whose real intentions are entirely concealed behind the language of opportunity. Minto had used social media to reach Sasha. He had constructed the fiction of a job offer in a digital space where verification is difficult and trust is easy to manufacture. In the years since, the conversation about what safeguards should exist for young people in online spaces has grown louder and more urgent, and Sasha's case is woven into that conversation as one of its most painful illustrations. The forensic record is equally haunting in what it reveals about the moment of Sasha's death. She had defended herself. The defense wounds on her hands and arms meant that in those final moments, even as an adult man wielded a kitchen knife against her with lethal force, she had not given up. She had fought back. It is a detail that those who care about her return to again and again, not because it changes anything, not because it softens the grief, but because it says something about who Sasha Marsden was in the most extreme moment any person can face. She did not go quietly. She was 16, she was alone, and she was terrified, and she still fought. Sasha could only be identified by DNA taken from her toothbrush, a detail that sits in the mind long after the mechanics of the case have been understood. Her parents stood in their family home and handed over their daughter's toothbrush so that scientists could confirm what they already feared. It is the kind of detail that collapses the distance between a news story and a human life, that makes abstract the unbearably specific. A toothbrush, a household object, the most ordinary thing in the world. Blackpool continues to glow and pulse with its famous lights every autumn, the illuminations drawing visitors who eat chips on the seafront and ride the trams and take photographs of a town that has always known how to present its best face to the world. And somewhere in that town, in the hearts of two sisters named Katie and Gemma, the name Sasha Marsden is spoken every single day, in advocacy meetings and petition campaigns and BBC interviews and the private, unrecorded conversations that family members have with the dead, in the hours when the lights have gone out and the quiet is absolute. David Minto is serving his sentence. The minimum term of 35 years runs until 2048. He will stand before a parole board someday, unless the law changes, unless the campaigns of the women who loved Sasha Marsden find the legislative traction they have been seeking for over a decade. And until that day comes, or until it is prevented from coming, Sasha's family will keep doing what they have done since the morning they identified their daughter and sister by her toothbrush. They will show up, speak out, and refuse to let the world forget the young woman with dreams of working with children, who went to a job interview on a January morning and never came home. Story 6. In the shadow of the Stellenbosch Mountains, where the air carried the faint sweetness of ripening grapes and the distant hum of student laughter, Hannah Cornelius lived a life woven from quiet dreams and gentle ambitions. Born on February 12, 1996, in Cape Town, South Africa, she was the eldest daughter of Willem and Anna Cornelius, a couple whose professional lives in the legal world painted a picture of stability and principle. Willem served as a magistrate in a nearby town, his days filled with the solemn weight of judgments that sought to balance justice with mercy. Anna, a practicing lawyer, brought her sharp intellect to cases that demanded both compassion and resolve. Their home was one of warmth and expectation, a place where books lined the shelves and conversations often turned to the broader strokes of right and wrong in a country still healing from its turbulent past. Hannah's early years unfolded like a soft melody on the piano keys she would later master. As a child, she was the kind who noticed the overlooked, the stray animal in the yard, the neighbor's quiet sorrow, and extended a hand without fanfare. 3 years after her birth, her brother arrived, a boy who would face the challenges of severe autism. Hannah became his steadfast guardian, patient and inventive in her efforts to bridge the gaps his condition created. She would sit with him for hours, turning lessons into games, her voice a soothing anchor amid his frustrations. It was this innate empathy that defined her, a trait that seemed to bloom naturally in the fertile soil of her family's values. Schooling brought out Hannah's brilliance in ways that surprised even those who knew her best. At Reddam House, a private school in Somerset West, she threw herself into drama classes, where her expressive talents shone on stage, drawing applause for roles that captured the raw edges of human emotion. Music was her other sanctuary. Her fingers danced across piano keys with a precision that spoke of deep passion. Academically, she excelled, graduating with 6 distinctions and an average score above 85%, a testament to her discipline and curiosity. Yet, Hannah was no isolated scholar. She was popular, her laughter easy and infectious, her circle of friends a lively tapestry of shared adventures. There was a high school sweetheart, a boy named Fellow, with whom she attended prom, her father's reluctant nod to her growing independence masking a deeper protectiveness. On the evening of May 26th, 2017, that world tilted on its axis, though Hannah could not have known it. The night air was cool and crisp, carrying the faint buzz of a Friday winding down. Hannah, now 21, had spent the evening with friends at a local bar, the kind of casual gathering that marked the rhythm of student life. Laughter flowed as freely as the drinks, stories bouncing between the group like fireflies in the dim light. Among them was Cheslin Marsh, a fellow student whose easy demeanor had made him a natural addition to the evening's circle. As the hours grew late, Hannah offered Cheslin a ride home in the Volkswagen Polo her grandmother had lent her, a modest blue car that hummed reliably through the town's winding roads. The drive back to Stellenbosch was unremarkable at first, the headlights cutting through the darkness as they chatted about classes, dreams, the small absurdities of university life. Cheslin lived in a student hostel in the suburb of Navarre, a quiet residential area where the streets narrowed and the houses huddled close. It was around 2 a.m. when they pulled up outside his place, the engine idling softly as they lingered in conversation, reluctant to end the night. The street was still, bathed in the pale glow of street lamps, the only sounds the distant chirp of crickets and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. Hannah leaned back in the driver's seat, her blonde hair catching the light, a smile playing on her lips. Cheslin, in the passenger seat, felt the comfort of the moment, unaware that shadows were stirring just beyond the car's perimeter. Unseen until it was too late, for men approached from the gloom. They moved with predatory silence, their figures emerging like specters from the night. Vernon Whitboy, 33, led the group, his face hardened by years of petty crime and evasion. Beside him was Geraldo Parsons, 27, whose quick temper masked a deeper volatility. Nashville Julius, 29, and Eben Van Niekerk, 28, followed close, each carrying the weight of their shared history in the underbelly of Stellenbosch's fringes. They called themselves the Pack of Wolves, a loose gang born from the desperation of township life, where opportunity was scarce and survival often meant seizing what wasn't yours. Armed with a screwdriver and a flick knife, they encircled the car in seconds, their eyes gleaming with intent. The ambush was swift and brutal. A sharp tap on the window shattered the calm, followed by the glint of metal as the knife pressed against the glass. "Open the door," one growled, his voice low and menacing. Panic surged through Cheslin and Hannah like a cold wave. She fumbled for the lock, her hands trembling, while Cheslin's mind raced for an escape that didn't exist. The doors yielded, and the men piled in, two in the back, Whitboy sliding into the passenger seat beside Cheslin, forcing him toward the rear. Hannah was wedged between the front seats, her body a barrier of fear as the car lurched forward under Parsons' control at the wheel. The engine roared as they sped away, the hostel's lights fading in the rearview mirror. Inside the confined space, the air thickened with threat. The men barked orders, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of demands for money, phones, valuables. Cheslin tried to keep his composure, whispering to Hannah to stay calm, his words a fragile lifeline. "Everything's going to be okay," he murmured, though his heart pounded with doubt. Hannah's eyes, wide with terror, met his briefly, a silent plea passing between them. The gang rifled through their pockets, snatching jewelry and cash, their hands rough and invasive. They drove aimlessly at first, the Polo weaving through Stellenbosch's outskirts toward a nearby petrol station. CCTV footage from the station would later capture the harrowing scene. The car pulling up under the harsh fluorescent lights, one of the men, Julius, dragging Cheslin to the ATM machine. "Give us the PIN," he snarled, the knife's edge a constant reminder of compliance. Cheslin's mind blanked under the pressure, providing a wrong number in his haze of fear. Frustration boiled over. The men shoved him back into the car, the failed withdrawal fueling their rage. Hannah sat silent in the front, her gaze fixed ahead, as if willing the nightmare to dissolve like mist. The drive turned darker, leading them to a remote dirt road on the edge of town, where the city lights gave way to endless fields and the oppressive quiet of isolation. Here, the gang's brutality escalated. They hauled Cheslin from the car, forcing him into the bushes. Bricks materialized from the roadside, crude weapons born of impulse. "Lie down," Whitboy commanded, his voice devoid of mercy. Cheslin complied, his body curling on the cold ground as the first blow landed. Pain exploded across his skull, the world blurring into red. Blow after blow followed, the men taking turns until they believed him dead. Blood pooled beneath him, his breath shallow and ragged. They left him there, a broken form amid the scrub, convinced their work was done. Miraculously, Cheslin stirred hours later, his body a map of agony. Partial deafness clouded his hearing, fractures marred his frame, but a fierce will to survive propelled him to crawl toward the road. He flagged down a passerby, words tumbling out in gasps, a description of the car, the men, the girl named Hannah. Help arrived, but Hannah was already lost to the night. With Cheslin discarded, the focus shifted entirely to Hannah. The men drove on, her small frame confined to the trunk now, the jolts of the uneven road a torment in themselves. They arrived at a rundown drug den on the outskirts, a squalid shack known to Whitboy as a haunt for fleeting escapes. There, amid the stench of stale smoke and decay, they pulled her out. The air was thick with the acrid bite of crystal meth, the men pressuring her to partake. Cannabis passed like a twisted offering, meth crystals glinting under a bare bulb. Hannah, exhausted and terrified, resisted at first, but the threats wore her down. The drugs clouded her mind, a chemical fog dulling the edges of her fear, yet sharpening the horror of what came next. One of the men, Parsons, suggesting a bargain, compliance for release. In the twisted logic of their world, it was a negotiation, though Hannah's silence spoke volumes. They didn't release her. Instead, they bundled her back into the car and headed to an abandoned paintball park, its fields overgrown and silent under the pre-dawn sky. For hours that stretched into an eternity, the assault unfolded. Repeated rapes by the gang, joined briefly by another man who slipped away into anonymity. Hannah's body, once a vessel of grace and potential, became a battlefield of violation. The men took turns, their actions mechanical and devoid of humanity, the night's chill seeping into her bones as cries echoed unheard. As the first hints of dawn painted the horizon, they drove once more, toward the Norhoke Farm Road adjacent to a sprawling vineyard. The plan, prosecutors would argue, was for yet another assault amid the vines. But something shifted. Hannah, drawing on reserves of strength born from desperation, began to resist. She clung to the trunk's edge as they tried to pull her out, her nails scraping against metal, a final act of defiance. Panic flickered in the men's eyes, or perhaps annoyance. She didn't want to climb out, Parsons testified, his voice flat in the courtroom. She was holding on to the car. She started panicking. Eben Van Niekerk stepped forward, knife in hand. A stab to her neck, quick and vicious, silenced her struggle momentarily. But it wasn't enough for them. Kicks and punches rained down, her body crumpling to the dirt. Then the final atrocity. A massive rock, 82 pounds of unyielding stone meant to cover a borehole, was lifted by Whitboy and dropped twice onto her head as she was held down. The impact was catastrophic, ending her life in a moment of unimaginable cruelty. Her body lay still amid the vineyard's quiet promise, the morning sun rising indifferently on the scene. The gang didn't pause to reflect. High on their own impunity and the drugs coursing through them, they pressed on in the stolen polo. In Crayfontein, they spotted a woman walking to work, her solitary figure an easy target. They chased her down, snatching her bag and phone in a blur of motion, her screams fading as they sped away. But their luck was fraying. Undercover police, alerted by Cheslin's survival and the car's description, spotted the polo on a main road. A high-speed chase ensued, sirens wailing through the morning traffic, ending in a screech of tires and the clatter of arrests. The men were apprehended on May 28th and 29th, 2017. Whitboy, Parsons, Julius, and Van Niekerk, still reeking of the night's excesses, Hannah's blood staining the vehicle's interior. News of the crime spread like wildfire through Stellenbosch, a university town unaccustomed to such raw violence piercing its idyllic facade. Students whispered in hostels, parents clutched their children closer, and the community reeled from the loss of one so full of light. Hannah's body had been discovered earlier that morning by two borehole pump technicians driving along the farm road. They found her partially clothed, the massive rock nearby, her face unrecognizable from the trauma. The identification came through fingerprints, a bureaucratic cruelty that preceded the devastating call to her family. Willem Cornelius was at home when the police arrived, the knock on the door a harbinger he couldn't ignore. Anna was away, but the news shattered him. Their daughter, their vibrant Hannah, gone in the most horrific way imaginable. He drove to the morgue, the world blurring through tears, steeling himself for the unimaginable. Anna returned soon after, her lawyer's composure cracking under the weight. Their son, already navigating a world of challenges, couldn't grasp the void, his incomprehension a mercy and a torment. The investigation moved with urgency. Forensic teams combed the polo, the paintball park, the vineyard, DNA evidence linking the men irrevocably to the crimes. Cheslin's testimony, though delivered from a hospital bed, painted a vivid picture of the abduction. Witnesses from the petrol station corroborated the timeline, and the gang's own boasts in the drug den unraveled under interrogation. The charges mounted: murder, rape, attempted murder, robbery with aggravating circumstances, kidnapping. The Western Cape High Court in Cape Town would host the trial, a process that drew national attention and ignited debates on South Africa's persistent struggles with gender-based violence and crime. As the legal machinery ground forward, the Cornelius family confronted grief's relentless tide. Willem and Anna poured their anguish into action, founding the Hannah Cornelius Foundation. It aimed to support underprivileged youth in Stellenbosch, providing education, counseling, a path away from the cycles of poverty and violence that had claimed their daughter. Hannah was always compassionate, a family friend would say, deeply moved by people's stories and struggles. The foundation became her legacy, a beacon in the darkness, though it couldn't fill the chasm left behind. The trial began in 2018, a grueling marathon of testimonies that laid bare the night's horrors. Prosecutor Eric Ntabazalila presented the case with unflinching detail, calling experts to describe the autopsy: multiple stab wounds, blunt force trauma, signs of prolonged assault. Cheslin took the stand, his voice steady despite the scars, physical and emotional, that marked him. "I kept telling her to stay calm," he recounted, his eyes distant. "I prayed when they beat me, asking for forgiveness." His survival was a miracle, but it carried the burden of witnessing Hannah's fate without saving her. The accused mounted defenses laced with denial and deflection. Whitboy claimed he played no active role in the rape or murder, portraying himself as a reluctant participant swept along by the others. Parsons admitted to the first assault but shifted blame, insisting Hannah's resistance provoked the fatal turn. Van Niekerk professed ignorance, baffling the court with claims he didn't understand his arrest. Julius, the youngest in involvement, acknowledged the group's presence but denied the extremes. Their prior convictions, robbery, assault, drug offenses, painted a portrait of habitual offenders who had squandered chances at redemption. Judge Roshni Ali presided with a steady hand, her rulings cutting through the obfuscation. On October 2018, after weeks of evidence, she found Whitboy, Parsons, and Van Niekerk guilty on all major counts: murder, rape, attempted murder of Cheslin, robbery, and kidnapping. Julius received convictions on lesser charges, his role deemed participatory, but not direct in the killing. The courtroom held its breath as sentences were handed down in November. Life imprisonment for the three primary perpetrators, with no parole eligibility, a combined total of 358 years across the group. Cheers erupted from the public gallery, a raw outpouring of relief and rage, though it brought no Hannah back. Willem testified in the sentencing phase, his words a raw elegy. "It is my belief that our family died when Hannah died," he said, voice breaking. "We are the survivors living in the ruins." He spoke of Anna's unraveling, her once vibrant spirit dimmed. Just a year after Hannah's death, in May 2018, Anna took her daily swim in the Atlantic Ocean off Cape Town. The waters were icy and stormy, conditions she knew well. Her body was found in shallow waves, ruled an accidental drowning. Yet Willem confided doubts. She walked into the ocean and didn't return. She no longer had the physical or mental strength. Anna's passing left Willem and their son adrift, the foundation their fragile tether. Years passed, the echoes of the case rippling through South Africa. Hannah's essence, not as a victim alone, but as a force of empathy and light. Cheslin, rebuilding his life, spoke of forgiveness's complexity, his partial deafness a constant reminder. The foundation grew, aiding dozens of children, channeling Hannah's compassion into tangible change. Willem's own health faltered. Cancer struck 3 months after Hannah's death, a cruel coda to their losses. He fought valiantly, but succumbed on December 9, 2022, leaving their son in the care of extended family. The pack of wolves faded into prison's anonymity, their lives a footnote to the vibrancy they extinguished. Yet Hannah's story endures, a haunting reminder of vulnerability in a land of stark contrasts. In Stellenbosch's vineyards, where she drew her final breath, the grapes still ripen, a cycle unbroken. Her legacy whispers through the foundation's efforts, in the friends who carry her laughter, in the community's resolve to confront the shadows. The murder of Hannah Cornelius was not just a crime. It was a fracture in the human tapestry, mended imperfectly by memory and justice. For those who loved her, the pain remains a quiet companion, but so does the light she left behind, a testament to a life that, though brutally cut short, illuminated the world. Story 7. The city of Hammond, Indiana, sits flush against the sprawling metropolis of Chicago, a place of industry and smokestacks, of hard-working families and quiet, tree-lined streets. It is a city defined by its proximity to the Great Lake and the Great City, a place where the rhythm of life is steady and unassuming. On Gosselin Street, in a neighborhood of modest, well-kept homes, stood the small brick house that was the entire world for Dorothy and William Zaney. For more than 50 years, this house had been their sanctuary, a fortress of memory built brick by brick, year by year. By May of 2006, Dorothy was 85 and William was 91. Their lives had slowed to a gentle, predictable rhythm, governed by the rising and setting of the sun and the small, cherished rituals of a lifetime together. William, once a strong steelworker, was now confined to a wheelchair, his world having shrunk to the familiar dimensions of their home. Dorothy was his caregiver, his companion, his anchor. She was a woman of formidable spirit, her 85 years having etched lines of laughter and determination onto her face, but they had not dimmed the bright, fierce love she held for her family. Her greatest joy, outside of her husband and the sprawling family that orbited them, was her garden. The small patch of earth behind their house was her canvas. In the spring and summer, it was a riot of color, a testament to her patient, nurturing hands. It was a place of life, of growth, a place where she could feel the sun on her back and the soil under her fingernails. It was her sanctuary within the sanctuary of her home. No one could have imagined that this place of peace would become the setting for an act of violence so brutal, so senseless, that it would leave a permanent scar on the heart of the community and a question that would haunt a family for years to come. The evening of May 23, 2006, began like any other in the Zaney household. The familiar smells of dinner cooking on the stove filled the small house, a comforting aroma that spoke of routine and care. Dorothy was in the kitchen, preparing a meal for herself and the husband she had tended to for so long. William was in his wheelchair in another room, the television casting a flickering blue light into the gathering dusk. It was a scene of domestic tranquility, a portrait of enduring love in the twilight of life. Sometime that evening, a sound from the backyard broke the quiet rhythm of the house. It was a noise out of place, a disruption to the familiar soundtrack of their lives. For Dorothy, a woman fiercely protective of her home, a sound from the outside was something to be investigated. Perhaps it was an animal in her beloved garden. Perhaps it was a neighborhood kid cutting through the yard. She likely turned from the stove, wiping her hands on her apron. "I'll be right back," she might have said to William, her voice carrying the easy confidence of a woman in command of her own small kingdom. She opened the back door and stepped out into the cool spring air, into the sanctuary of her garden. She never came back. Inside, William waited. The minutes stretched into an unknowable length of time. The familiar, comforting smell of dinner began to change. It grew sharp, acrid. A thin tendril of smoke curled from the kitchen, then another. The pot on the stove, forgotten in the sudden rush to investigate the noise, was beginning to burn. The smoke thickened, filling the small house, a choking, gray fog that stung the eyes and caught in the throat. For William, trapped in his wheelchair, a new kind of terror began to set in. The house was filling with smoke, and his wife, his Dorothy, had not returned. He was helpless, a prisoner in his own home, as the smoke alarm began to shriek its shrill, insistent warning into the night. It was the alarm that saved him. A neighbor, hearing the piercing cry, rushed over. They found the house thick with smoke, an elderly man in a wheelchair calling out in confusion and fear, and a pot of food blackened and burning on the stove. The immediate crisis was averted. The pot was taken off the heat, the windows thrown open to the night air. But one question hung in the smoky haze. Where was Dorothy? The search was short, and its conclusion horrific. There, in the backyard, amidst the budding flowers and the turned earth of her garden, lay Dorothy Zaney. She had been brutally, savagely attacked. The cause of death was later determined to be blunt force trauma to the head, a massive skull fracture that had ended her life in a storm of unimaginable violence. She had been bludgeoned to death in the one place on earth where she should have been safest. The Hammond police arrived to a scene of profound and baffling tragedy. The sheer brutality of the crime was shocking. An 85-year-old woman murdered in her own backyard. But the circumstances were deeply perplexing. Nothing of value appeared to have been taken from the house. There were no signs of a forced entry, and her 91-year-old, wheelchair-bound husband had been left completely unharmed. Robbery did not seem to be the motive. This was not a crime of opportunity. This was an act of pure, unadulterated violence, an explosion of rage directed at a defenseless elderly woman. Who would do such a thing? And why? The community was stunned. Dorothy was a beloved figure, a matriarch not just of her own family, but of the neighborhood. She was the kind of woman who watched out for the local children, who always had a kind word for a neighbor. The idea that such a violent end could meet such a gentle life was something the mind struggled to comprehend. "We can't get our heads around this," her granddaughter, Angela Patterson, told the Chicago Tribune. "There's no one that would want to do this to her." The family was plunged into a nightmare of grief and confusion. They remembered Dorothy as the vibrant, loving heart of their world. They remembered the Sunday dinners, the holidays, the simple, everyday moments of a life lived with generosity and grace. Now, all they had were memories and the horrifying image of her final moments. They were left to grapple with a loss that was made all the more unbearable by its senselessness. As the Hammond police dug into the investigation, they found themselves at a dead end. There were no witnesses to the attack, no forensic evidence that pointed to a suspect. The weapon was never found. The crime seemed to have been committed by a ghost, a phantom who had emerged from the darkness to commit a terrible act and then vanished without a trace. But as investigators looked beyond the borders of their own quiet city, a chilling and terrifying possibility began to emerge. Dorothy Zaney's murder was not an isolated event. It was the latest in a string of brutal, seemingly random bludgeoning attacks that had been terrorizing the greater Chicagoland area for the past year. A pattern was beginning to take shape, a pattern of violence so specific and so savage that it pointed to the terrifying possibility of a serial killer, a hammer murderer, stalking the most vulnerable residents of the city and its suburbs. The wave of terror had begun almost a year earlier, in June 2005. Peter D'Agostino, a 48-year-old college professor, a small, bookish man, was walking home from work in broad daylight when a man in a car pulled up beside him. Without a word, the man got out, attacked D'Agostino with a sledgehammer, and drove away, leaving him to die on the sidewalk. The attack was witnessed, and a composite sketch of the killer was created, but he was never identified. For months, there was a lull. And then, in the spring of 2006, the violence erupted again with terrifying frequency. On April 3rd, Anna Mae Davis, a 59-year-old woman, was found bludgeoned to death in her Chicago home. 3 weeks later, on April 26th, a 14-year-old girl walking to school was attacked from behind by a man with a hammer. Miraculously, she survived, and her description of her attacker bore a chilling resemblance to the composite sketch from the D'Agostino murder. The very next day, on April 27th, 74-year-old Evelina Blaine was found murdered in her home, less than 5 blocks from where Anna Mae Davis had been killed. She too had been bludgeoned to death, and then, less than a month later, Dorothy Zaney was killed in her garden in Hammond. The method was the same. The victim profile was the same: someone who was elderly, small, or otherwise physically vulnerable, someone who could not fight back. The lack of a clear motive in each case was the same. The geography was the same: a tight cluster of attacks in Chicago and its immediate cross-border suburb. For law enforcement, it was a terrifying puzzle. Were the cases connected? The similarities were too stark to ignore. But publicly, police departments were hesitant to link the crimes, perhaps for fear of creating a public panic. They were dealing with a predator who seemed to strike at random, a shadow man who moved through the city with a hammer and a heart full of rage, choosing his victims based on their perceived weakness. The connection, however tentative, cast Dorothy's murder in an even more terrifying light. She was not the victim of a random burglar she had startled. She was, it seemed, the latest victim of a serial killer, a woman whose only crime was to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, to be seen as an easy target by a predator who was hunting the helpless. But even with this broader context, the investigation into Dorothy's murder stalled. The trail went cold. The hammer murderer, if indeed it was a single person, seemed to vanish as suddenly as he had appeared. The string of brutal attacks stopped. The headlines faded. The city moved on. But for the Zaney family, there was no moving on. There was only the gaping hole where their matriarch had been, and the gnawing, unanswered question of who had taken her from them and why. Years passed. William Zaney lived out his final days without his beloved Dorothy, the trauma of her death a constant companion. The garden behind the house on Gosselin Street became overgrown, its colors fading, a silent, poignant memorial to the woman who had once tended it with such love. The case of Dorothy Zaney became another file in the cold case archives, a story of unsolved violence. But the calls never came. The crucial piece of information that would break the case open never materialized. The killer remained a phantom, his identity, his motives, his story, all lost to the silence of the past. The murder of Dorothy Zaney is a story without an ending. It is a testament to the brutal fact that sometimes there is no justice. Sometimes the guilty are not caught. Sometimes the question of why is never answered. It is a story about the fragility of peace, about the way violence can erupt in the most unexpected of places, shattering the quiet lives of good people. It is the story of a beloved grandmother, a caregiver, a gardener, who stepped out into her own backyard on a spring evening and met a monster. Her killer did not just take her life. He stole a family's sense of safety, their belief in a just and orderly world. He replaced it with a permanent, aching void, a wound that time can never fully heal. Today, more than a decade and a half later, the case remains open. Dorothy Zaney is not forgotten. Her name is a whisper in the archives of unsolved crimes, a face on a cold case website, a memory cherished by a family who still waits for an answer that may never come. And in a quiet neighborhood in Hammond, Indiana, a small brick house stands as a silent monument to a life of love and a death of unspeakable and unsolved brutality.